Okay, so this is going to be your study guide review for exam one. Okay, so for chapter two, when I'm talking about social stratification, it's really just the definition in the textbook. So the idea that, stratification means that some people are ranked higher than others, right? Um, it's basically a way for people to, you know, um, categorize people, right? Income versus wealth, just the idea that income is the money that you make per year, and wealth is the kind of total accumulation of all the crap that you have. The poverty gap, right? That's just the idea that there's a difference between the amount of money that the official poverty line calculates and how much money it actually takes for a poor household to support themselves, right? Um, let's see. Who's at greatest risk when it comes to poverty? We talked about the groups that were the most at risk were by age, children, by gender, women, and by race, predominantly minorities, people of color, and people that live in either rural or very urban areas. The underclass, again, the definition from your book, that's what I'm looking for there. Let's see, problems linked to poverty. Just, a lot of those things we talked about on that slide when we were talking about problems linked to poverty. So health issues, school, right? The fact that people receive limited schooling, political alienation, substandard housing, homelessness, all that kind of stuff that we talked about. Let's see, culture of poverty argument basically says that there's ways that poor people live that encourage their own poverty. And so it's kind of one of those victim blaming logics that says that, poor people are just have cultural problems that lead them to be poor, not necessarily looking at the like structural issues about systemic poverty. Let's see, meritocracy is kind of linked to that, right? The idea that, you know, um, it's an equal playing field and everyone has the same opportunity. So your social standing reflects how hard you worked for something, right? So if you're poor, you just didn't work as hard. That's the argument of meritocracy. So again, kind of going back to victim blaming, it's a way that we decide, we basically figure out how people that suffer from a specific issue are different than the rest of other people in society. And then we try and blame that difference as the cause of the social problem, right? So, when we talked about later on in gender, the idea of victim blaming when it comes to sexual assault and rape, we tend to try and single out what factors are related based on the victim and not based on the perpetrator. So they'll say, oh, well, what were you wearing? You know what I mean? Were you drinking? Were you whatever? As if those are atypical factors or as if those are things that women shouldn't be able to do, right? Without fear of being sexually assaulted. So, anyway, victim blaming is just kind of like singling out a person and saying, okay, here's what's different about you, and that is what makes you at fault. Anyway, patriarchy is just a social pattern of societies where men are seen more favorably than women, or they have more power or clout or prestige. Intersection theory is just, looking at not just one social factor like your social class or your race or your gender or your sexuality or your ability or your age or the region that you live in or your nationality, et cetera. I could go on forever. Um, intersection theory is really talking about how we need to look at how all of those things overlap so we can see how we have multiple dimensions of disadvantage, right? So, if you're just looking at race, you could say, okay, well, people of color have less opportunities than white people, right? But then when you separate that out by gender, what are the differences between people of color and their opportunities when it comes to work if you're male or you're female, or if you are cisgendered or if you're transgendered, right? Those kind of things matter, and they add multiple dimensions of difference. So your experience, if you're really, really marginalized, if you have like 5 or 6 of these categories of marginalization, is going to be very different than someone that's much more privileged in that scale. Okay, chapter 3, race as socially constructed. I mean, that's pretty obvious, I feel like. Basically, that it's not a biological marker of genetic difference, right? That's the argument that people try and make in society is like, oh, it's biologically different. It's like, well, if so, then why is it that we see more genetic variation between or within a race than between races? Right? Why is it that if we give blood, we don't give blood for a specific racial or ethnic grouping? It's because when it comes down to it, biologically, we're very similar, right? So it's much more of a social understanding of how we group people based on how they look or certain, traits, basically. So of course, biological traits are involved, but it's basically lumping an entire category of people together based on like melanin, right? Um, Instead of, yeah, yeah. Anyway, I can keep going. Minority majority interactions, genocide. These ones are all genocide, segregation, assimilation, pluralism. Those are all the definitions from your book. So genocide, systematic killing of one group of people by another. Segregation, physically separating people, right, by groups. Assimilation is just when you try to basically make minorities adopt the dominant patterns or culture of the dominant group. And then pluralism is kind of the opposite of that, where you accept people's differences and give them equal social standing regardless of their differences. Okay, so then prejudice, same deal, just the definition from your book, as well as racism, same thing. So prejudice is basically unfounded generalizations about people, but racism is more specific. It is a prejudice, but it's a prejudice about someone's racial or ethnic category, assuming that some people are biologically inferior to others. Institutional racism is a little bit farther, like it takes it a different step farther. It's how racism operates when within the systems of the institutions themselves. So like within the legal system or within the court system is what I mean by that. Or, within government, within all of these things. We can see within industry, within religion, within families, right? How does racism operate inside of those institutions? Institutional discrimination, similar, but it's the idea that our social values are often built into the institutions that we build at the time period that they're built. So since a lot of our institutions were built, in the basically either late 1700s, early 1800s, the value systems of those times that didn't really value a lot of groups of people are kind of built into the institutions that we still use today. So that means, often the economy, the school, the legal system, those kind of institutions are going to have impacts from the past of assuming that certain people weren't people or didn't have the same amount of rights or shouldn't have the same amount of rights. Affirmative action policies are policies that try to, break the barriers that people face when it comes to prejudice and discrimination at place within the economic world or within the world of work. So basically, often affirmative action policies are also used for college and things like that. Basically, saying that, if we know statistically that, women are less likely to work in certain industries because of prejudice, or we know that people of color are less likely to work in certain industries because of prejudice, then we give people opportunities within those industries that they might have been systematically kept out of before based on people's prejudice all the way across the hiring spectrum and all of that. Like there's a video I'll show you guys later when we talk about work about how this guy basically changed his name from Jose to Joe on job applications and magically got like 1,000 responses on all his job applications, even though he had submitted all the same exact applications under the name Jose. But it was the racialized nature of that understanding that meant that, he didn't get as many opportunities. So it's a subtle thing. It's not as if people are really like intentionally often doing that, but it's the fact that racism and prejudice are things that are so taken into our brains that we often don't realize we're doing it. So that's what affirmative action policies are supposed to counteract, is those subtle biases. And some people argue that affirmative action goes too far and then it becomes reverse discrimination, meaning that it discriminates against white people. But again, that kind of assumption says that, oh, well, who deserves to have the job? Who deserves to have the home? Who deserves to have that space in the college? Oh, white people. Well, why by default do white people deserve that? right? When people of color through these affirmative action policies aren't necessarily getting a leg up on people that otherwise aren't qualified. It's not as if they're taking someone that's a C student and giving them a full ride to Stanford in place of a white person, right? But that's kind of the narrative that's heard in the culture. Even though, to be able to qualify for that affirmative action policy, you would still need to have crazy straight A's, all the extracurriculars, all the same kind of stuff you would need by applying. But the idea is through the affirmative action policies, the college and university would have to at least look at your application, at least consider your application because of your race, right? That doesn't mean that the quota systems and all of these kind of nefarious things that people are saying, it's not fair. Why can't my kid get in? Well, maybe because by allowing other people to enter these spheres, you're kind of expanding the scope of who's determined as worthy. And so what's interesting is when California ended the affirmative action within colleges, percentage of people of color that were attending went from about 26% to about 4 to 5%. So it shows that without policies in place to kind of protect people of color, at least give them the opportunity to be reviewed or heard or given at least some consideration, that was an immediate 20% drop in enrollment. So that's crazy. Okay, chapter 4, gender and sex, same thing from your book. The gender is your social understanding of what a man or a woman is, and sex is the biological assignment at birth kind of thing based on your equipment. So if you're XXXY, or of course we talked about how there's people that are both or in between, but basically one's a biological, one's a social. Okay, patriarchy is a pattern that is not just something we see in this country, but is something that we see all over the world, right? Kind of comes from this colonial logic. And so it spread as colonialism spread, this logic that men should dominate women, that women are subservient. So like within our own culture, when colonial settlers displaced and, committed genocide against the Native Americans, a lot of the cultural practices that Native Americans had of revering women or, considering women equals were destroyed or were, eliminated because, they were trying to force people to assimilate to the Western standard. So anyway, patriarchy is something that's not just American, right? There's a lot of places. Women advertising, I'm talking about that Jean Kilbourne video I made you guys watch. So if you want to review it, I'd suggest watch that part of the PowerPoint. When she talks about how, when women are represented a certain way through the media, women often go through harmful behaviors in order to achieve the ideal presented by the media, even though it's photoshopped and not real. So they might starve themselves or develop eating disorders, or oftentimes women will realize their only value is their beauty or their appearance, so they'll start to sexualize themselves for, the acceptance of others. And so by default, men come to see women as objects because they see like thousands and thousands of advertisements. They see women sexualizing themselves in their real lives. And they come to believe that, the most important thing about a woman is how she looks, and that, their most important role is to kind of conquer her sexually. So, we kind of separate women from their humanity through this process because we turn them into like sex objects, like they are, parts, like body parts and not people. So then, of course, the ads, basically the whole point of advertisements is to make people feel like crap about their bodies so that they will change themselves to fit the standard. But through that, women, end up feeling very negative about their bodies. Like she says in the video clip, which I suggest you rewatch, she says, how sexy can you feel when you hate your body, right? So the sexuality is only for the perfect and the young. And so that means that most people lose sexual agency because they don't feel comfortable in their skin, so they're not going to feel sexual, right? Anyway, so I suggest you watch that video again. Let's see, Bechdel test. The other video right past that, just like that 2-minute video, talks about what is the Bechdel test. And remember, this doesn't mean a film is feminist. It just means that it has any representation of women, basically. So it has to have 2 female characters that speak and have names and then talk to each other about something that's not a man. And it's pretty startling how few films meet that qualification. Gender stratification, it's just stratification. We talked about that kind of unequal distribution of wealth, resources, opportunities, whatever, but by gender. So basically saying that there's a different privilege between men and women. that, women basically have certain expectations that are put on them by society. And of course, they have a higher risk of, domestic violence, rape, sexual assault, all that kind of stuff. Um, let's see. When it comes to gender and work, what I'm talking about there is the pay gap. That's basically what I'm talking about there. Glass ceiling, that's just the literal definition from your book. Discrimination that blocks the movement of women into higher positions. Violence against women, just that it's a serious problem in our culture, right? Because it really links these issues of masculinity to violence. And so if men are taught that they have to deal with issues with violence, then that often spills over into the actual real world. And a lot of this takes place behind closed doors in homes, and people don't really know about it. Sexual harassment, what I want you to know there is that, just kind of what the definition is, right? But that it also more what I showed you guys in that clip. So just the definition that it's when you have unwanted comments, gestures, physical contact, all that kind of stuff that you learn about if you have to do HR training at your job. But it's also this idea that it creates a hostile environment where people feel very uncomfortable and they don't want to go to work, right? But also what we learned from that clip, that it wasn't really defined as a social problem until the 1980s, which is insane when you think about it. And the Anita Hill case, right? How that kind of came about. Let's see. Naomi Wolf's beauty myth. Again, another video clip. I suggest you watch that too. Sorry, lots of clips. Just basically that she argues that, beauty is promoted for being universal, eternal, healthy, and sexual, right? That's her argument. And that is the beauty myth, because none of those things are true, right? That there's these certain industries like that want you to spend all your money to try and fit that ideal. But she kind of goes through the reasons why, really briefly, why the beauty standard isn't eternal, it isn't universal, it's not healthy, and it's not sexual. Intersection theory as it pertains to gender. So when you're looking at gender stratification, intersection's trying to say that, that there are often groups that have multiple disadvantages based on those other categories, right? So again, that looking at gender is important, but it's important to also factor in some of those other marginalities like race, social class, etc. Feminism is just, the definition there, political movement seeking equality of women and men, right? Straightforward. The F word. 6 general points about feminism, they're on your slide, right? So I'm just going to pull from a couple of those 6 points. Those are those things that feminists agree upon. And then types of feminism, I'm going to have a couple questions about that. Those ideas of like, what's the difference between a liberal feminist, a socialist feminist, a radical feminist, a multicultural feminist, and a global feminist. So, we went through that a bit, so hopefully that makes sense in class. And, just a little bit of the nuances between them. What are they focusing on, right? And of course, there was a little overlap. We talked about that. But I will try and make it, it's pretty clear which ones I'm talking about when I'm talking about it. Okay, so that's that. And then as far as the essay questions, what is gender stratification? So I want the definition. In what ways does gender stratification harm men and women? So what I'm looking for there is obviously in the book, it talks quite a bit about how women are harmed through gender stratification, but also in the film that we watched, they talked quite a bit about how men are harmed from gender stratification. The idea that men are above women, that we have these 2 kind of categories of behavior and expectations about, men can't show emotions, women, aren't considered strong or leaders, like those kind of things, how that affects both sides of that aisle. That's what I'm looking for there. And I want you to have some sort of example for both men and women, right? So remember, when you're answering these questions, it doesn't have to be a super long response, but what it has to do is answer both parts of the question and each part. So if it says harm men and women, make sure you're talking about both. Okay, what's the difference between income and wealth? So first off, just lay that out. Income is the money you're taking in. Wealth is the accumulation of all of the stuff. And why is it important to understand the difference in order to study financial inequalities? That's a big one. I would suggest you go back to the PowerPoint when we talked about chapter 2, sorry, where, the video I showed in maybe the first or second slide, somewhere in there, that talks about how unequal society really is when it comes to income and wealth. that, over the last 30, 40 years, these things have gotten much, much worse. And so if you're only looking at income, you're missing the larger picture of how a ridiculously small group of the population, 1%, is now controlling the overwhelming majority of all the wealth that exists in this culture. So it's becoming more and more stratified to the point that we have the worst inequality now, like financially, that we've had since the Great Depression. So, what I want you to talk about there is just kind of explain, go back to look at that video, kind of explain some issues from that, like the idea that a CEO gets paid, that much more than one of his employees 380 times, like those kind of things, and really explore how that relates to studying financial inequalities. Because remember, if we're not taking into account the kind of nuanced differences between income and wealth when we're studying these things, then we're not going to actually see the full picture of the inequality that's going on. And if we don't see the full picture, how do we address it? How do we make it better? How do we improve people's lives in those, situations because they're being affected by this? So that's kind of what I'm looking for, or like where I'm pushing you in that direction to kind of come up with an answer that hopefully satisfies that. Okay, so that's that. Hopefully this makes sense. And yeah,